Hello, my name is Justin Haskins. The United Nations wants you to stop eating so much meat. Put the hamburger down. Put the chicken sandwich down. You don't need chicken. You don't need hamburger. You don't need a nice lamb roast or ham. No, put all that down. Put it away. Have a juicy, crispy cricket burger or something instead. Have lab-grown meat. That's better for the planet. That's what the United Nations would have you believe. We're going to get into all of that and how this is just the start. It's going to get a whole lot worse than that. And I'm not speculating. I've got actual proof that it's going to get a lot worse than that on this episode of the Justin Haskins Show. But before we get into that, a quick call to action. Please subscribe to the channel. It helps more people see the video. The channel is still very new. I've been involved in conservative media, pro-liberty media for a long time. Been on Fox News dozens and dozens of times. Tucker Carlson tonight. Been on the Glenn Beck radio show a million times. I've worked with Glenn on 3 New York Times best-selling books. So I've been around for a long time, but I have never had my own channel until now. And I need subscribers to get the message out to people. So trying to do something unique, trying to build a new community, trying to talk about the topics that a lot of other people are not paying attention to, or angles on those topics that other people are not focusing on. So please subscribe to the channel. Please share these videos. Please like and leave a comment. All of those things are going to help help this content break through big tech algorithms that hold back videos like these. All right, so let's get into the topic. I want to pull up a video. This is from foxnews.com. United Nations set to call on Americans to reduce meat consumption. It says here that there's a leading United Nations agency overseeing food and agriculture policy is expected to issue a roadmap in the coming weeks, which will call on the West, including America, to dramatically reduce its meat consumption. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization will publish its so-called Global Food Systems Roadmap during the upcoming COP28 Climate Summit in Dubai, which, by the way, depends heavily on fossil fuels, which is kind of ironic, which will kick off on Thursday and extend nearly 2 weeks until mid-December. FAO's first-of-its-kind document will recommend that nations that overconsume meat, that's you, Americans, stop eating so much meat, to limit their consumption as part of a broader effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, according to a report by Bloomberg. All right. Now, what is this all about? Well, we'll tell you. We've got an expert in the Fox News article is quoted. Jeremy Kohler, the chair and founder of the Fairer Initiative, an investor network that works with financial institutions to promote climate-friendly agricultural worldwide, said this in a recent statement. The failure of leading meat and dairy companies to reduce emissions underlines the urgent need for more policy focus on the food and agricultural sector. Food system emissions deserve a place at the top of the table alongside energy and transport, as they represent an estimated third of greenhouse gas emissions and 40% of methane, he continued. Investors hope the first ever publication of a food and agricultural roadmap at COP28 this month will catalyze the transition to a 1.5 degrees and a more sustainable food system. Aren't you excited? Doesn't all this big globalist government nonsense make you so excited? I know what makes me excited. I'm all geared up to switch to crispy cricket sandwiches or whatever. You know, aren't you? Don't you want to do it? Don't you want the lab-grown meat? Aren't you just salivating at the mouth for a lab-grown meat burger? Like, of course you're not. Of course you're not. And if you are, you need help. You need help. So what is this all about? Is this really all about climate change? Well, that's what they say. That's the point of the COP28 meeting. COP28, the 28th time these people have gotten together, flown across the world on private jets, spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when they could have just jumped on a video conference call. Have you ever heard of Skype? You ever heard of it? Apparently not. So is this really about climate change? Well, here's what we know. I'm going to prove to you today this isn't about climate change. This actually has nothing to do with climate change, and I can prove it. And I'm going to. But I'm also going to show you how things are going to get a whole lot worse. This isn't the end of the story. This is just the beginning of the story. The United Nations has some extremely, extremely radical plans that it's rolling out for the end of the year, the end of next year, 2024, that has the potential to completely transform every part of your life. Sound fun? Even more fun than never eating a hamburger again? I mean, it's unreal, and we're going to get into all of that. So first, let's just talk about climate change and the climate change catastrophe and the argument that's being made here. So the argument that people like Mr. Caller here cited in Fox News' article, the argument that they make about CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally is that greenhouse gas emissions are the primary driver of climate change, that climate change is catastrophic or is going to become catastrophic, that the primary driver of it is human beings emitting too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, and that they do this through a variety of different ways, their cars, the electric system, and agriculture being one of those things. Agriculture is a major driver of methane emissions. Methane is a type of greenhouse gas emission. Methane makes up a relatively small proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions, but it is considered by a number of scientists to have an outsized impact on global warming relative to CO2 emissions. So even though methane emissions are a relatively small part of the pie, the total pie of greenhouse gas emissions, they have a bigger impact on global warming than CO2 emissions, or I shouldn't say they have a bigger impact, but they have a bigger impact than would be suggested by their percentage of the total greenhouse gas emissions pie. In other words, I think that they account for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but the impact they have is bigger than 15%. At least this is the things that I've read many times from climate scientists, okay? So even if we assume, so let's just assume all of that is true. Let's assume all of that is true, that global warming is primarily being caused by human beings. I know there are a lot of people that don't believe that, but let's just assume that it's true. Let's assume that methane emissions have an outsized impact on global warming. Let's just assume that that's also accurate. And let's assume, because this is true, that agriculture as an industry and livestock as an industry, a sub-industry of agriculture, that those things have a greater impact on methane emissions than other industries. And there's a good argument for that. Now, they aren't necessarily the primary emitter of methane, but they are, big emitters of methane. All right. Let's say all of that is true. Even if we assume all of that is true. And so I'm giving a lot to the other side here. I'm giving a lot to them. I'm saying, yep, I'm willing. I'll check off every one of those boxes for you, and I'll still prove that you're wrong. And here's how. Even if we say that methane is a contributor to global warming, there is no reason to believe that methane emissions, that we need to cut back on our meat consumption in America to avert some sort of climate change catastrophe. And the reason why is, let's just go to the data. This comes from the EPA. What you're looking at here is U.S. emissions of methane by inventory sector from 1990 to 2021. 2021 is the most recent year that we have data for this, okay, in the EPA database. What you'll notice is if you add up all the colors, this is the total methane. So the total methane was in million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, 407 in 1990. You don't need to understand what million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent means. It was 407 in 1990. Today, it is 302,347. This is for the energy industry. For agriculture, it was 240 in 1990, and it is 278 today. Now, I know this is really complicated math, but 240 to 278 is not a huge increase over 30 years. It's about 5% or so. So methane in agriculture is really not expanding dramatically. And over the past several years, beginning with, if we look at 2018 to today, it was 281 in 2018, and 2021, it's 278. So it actually went down slightly from 2018 to 2021. So it's been trending downward. And over the past 30 years or so, from 1990 to 2021, total methane emissions only went up by 5%. So it's just a little bit of an increase, not a lot. But the total methane, if you add up all these colors, that's what this chart is showing. The total methane was somewhere between 800 and 1,000 on this chart. You can see it here on the left-hand side. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this, 800 to 1,000. And now it's dipped just below 800. So what that means is total methane emissions in the United States have dropped. The total, according to the data in the EPA, 922 in 1990, 2021, 793. So we've had a decrease. If you do the percentage decrease calculation on that, it works out to being about 14%. So there's been about a 14% decrease in methane emissions over the past 30 years, even though people are eating just as many hamburgers as they always have. That hasn't changed. In fact, more burgers are probably being consumed today because we have more people than we did 30 years ago in the United States. And yet our total methane emissions are going down. Agricultural methane is staying relatively flat, but our energy, our methane emissions from the energy sector is going down. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that have to do with moving away from certain energy sources to other energy sources that has happened over time. But the point is, I think, pretty clear. The United States is reducing its methane emissions even without having to do anything with meat consumption. So there's really no reason to, when you're reducing your methane emissions, your country the size of the United States, and you're reducing your methane emissions by 15% over 30 years, that's pretty darn good. You don't need to dramatically change people's lifestyles, which is exactly what would happen if you told them they had to consume less meat in order to see methane emissions continue to drop. Methane emissions are going to continue to drop anyway. We don't need to do this. There's another important factor, though, and that important factor is China. Now, China's methane emissions over the same time period, from 1990 to roughly 2021, have dramatically increased. They have dramatically increased. So while the United States has been dropping its methane emissions, China has been increasing theirs. 75% is the number. From 1990 to 2021, the Chinese have increased methane emissions by 75%, while the United States has reduced its methane emissions by about 14%. So America isn't the problem here. Americans eating meat isn't the problem. Because as you could see from this chart, the largest part of the methane emissions equation, or if it isn't the largest, it's the largest part. The largest part of the methane emissions equation is is coming from the energy sector and from waste and things like that. You add up energy and waste, it's bigger than the agricultural part of the puzzle. So even if we were to reduce our methane emissions significantly in the United States in the agricultural industry, and you're not going to be able to do it by just not eating meat, there are other things like other products in the agricultural industry also result in more methane emissions. So you can't just cut out meat and say, okay, no more methane emissions. But even if we did that, we would still have methane emissions. They would go down, but we would still have them. And China would have way, way more methane emissions than we have. China has significantly more methane emissions than we have in the United States. In fact, let's see if we can pull that up right now on the fly here. But it's just, so the argument that methane emissions in the United States, that somehow cutting methane emissions in the United States is going to result in a reduction in global temperature is nonsense. It's nonsense because China is increasing their methane emissions by so much, 75% over 30 years, that there is nothing that we could do here in the United States that would have a significant impact on global warming relative to what's going on with China. And then, as I said, even if you wanted to say, well, we should still be contributing, we should still do our part, we should still do our fair share, even though they do way more methane emissions in China, even though they have way more people, even though they don't care about the environment anymore, even though they care about the environment significantly less than we do here in the United States, even though the United States has been cutting its methane emissions over the past 30 years by 14%, even though that's the case, even though that's what's going on, we should still cut methane emissions even more here in the United States. It's like, well, if you believe that, we will continue to cut methane emissions in the energy sector. We're going to continue to do that. But it's not going to have an impact on global warming, even if methane emissions are contributing to global warming, because methane emissions aren't the only thing contributing to global warming, and methane emissions in China are going up so rapidly that anything we do here in the United States is going to be offset by what they're doing in China. So it begs the question. Policymakers at the United Nations know this, right? The Biden administration, which has pledged to cut U.S. methane emissions. How? I don't exactly know, but that's what they've pledged to do. They know this too. They all know that cutting methane emissions isn't going to stop global warming, isn't going to save the planet from a supposed existential crisis. It's going to have no positive impact on global temperature. It's not going to matter. It's not going to have make any difference at all. It's just not. That's what science tells us. And any honest scientist would admit that that's the case. If China continues to do what they've been doing for 30 years, which is promising to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and then not doing it, dramatically increasing them instead, then what we do in the United States with our hamburgers is going to have absolutely zero effect on global temperature, regardless of the impact of methane on global temperature in general. So why do they want to do it? Why are they asking Americans to change their lifestyle, to change their diets, to change the energy sector, to change the cars that they drive? Why do they want all of these dramatic changes for Americans when they know the real problem, if you believe in the idea that greenhouse gas emissions are driving climate change, the real problem is what? It's China. It's India. It's the developing world. They're the ones who are dramatically increasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the United States that's dramatically doing that. It's other parts of the world with much larger populations, and they have a lot more room to grow in that area. So why are they telling Americans what to do? And what right does the United Nations have to tell Americans what to do anyway? Well, this is all part of a much larger push by the United Nations to dramatically expand its power, to dramatically expand its influence in the United States. And it touches a whole lot of areas, not just the environment. And I want to highlight one of those things that is related to the environment before we wrap up this episode. There's this proposal, and I've done videos on this before. If you go to the Justin Haskins channel on YouTube, or you check out the Justin Haskins podcast page with Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, etc. The show is available basically everywhere now. You will find an episode, several episodes that I did on something called Our Common Agenda. Our Common Agenda is this big campaign that was launched, I believe, in 2021, if I'm remembering right, that's going to lead up to this Summit of the Future that's going to be hosted in September 2024. I think it's going to be held in New York City, if I remember right. The page on the YouTube channel, if you're watching the YouTube version of the show, you'll be able to see it. This is Common Agenda. Our Common Agenda, and let's see if we can find the roadmap for it. Yeah, here's the road to the Summit of the Future. So the goal of Our Common Agenda is to develop a plan that accomplishes an international agreement that accomplishes the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda that was created in 2015 by member states, passed in 2015 by member states. That agreement will be called Pact for the Future, and it will be signed into law. It'll be a binding international agreement. That's what they're hoping. It'll be a binding international agreement in 2024. Now, whether it actually is binding for the United States is a separate issue, separate question. But the United States has already suggested, it's already signaled the Biden administration that it supports our common agenda. The Pact for the Future details, we don't exactly know all the details for it yet, but they have given us a massive roadmap for what they want. Many, many, many pages, like hundreds of pages long if you add up all the different policy papers and things that they've done on our common agenda. This is what the United Nations Secretary General's office and people like that want for member states to agree to. And when you look at some of the details, what you realize is that if this thing actually becomes law, meat consumption is going to be the least of your troubles. There are unbelievable amounts of authoritarian policies included in our common agenda. There's something called, for example, the emergency platform. The emergency platform would give not unlimited power, but a substantial amount of power to the Secretary General of the United Nations that he could renew whenever he feels like he needs to in the event of some sort of global crisis, which is defined by whatever they want a global crisis to be. It's really insane that we would give the United Nations that kind of power. That's just one part of it. There's another thing called the Global Digital Compact, which would call for a robust, it would provide a, quote, robust accountability criteria and standards for digital platforms and users to address disinformation, hate speech, and other harmful content online. So another way of stating that is it's worldwide rules governing free speech online. That's also in our common agenda. But maybe the thing that would impact you the most on a day-to-day basis in the short term would be some of the climate and biodiversity, environmental policies related in our common agenda. It's all tied up in what the United Nations long-term plan is. So this eating meat, this meat reduction thing is just the early stages of it. One of the things that they want to do is it wants massive new Green New Deal programs all over the world, including in the United States, net zero carbon dioxide mandates globally by 2050. So say goodbye to your gasoline powered car, your natural gas stove, your natural gas oven, natural gas heating. Say goodbye to all of that stuff. Your local coal fired power plant, for example, any of that, all gone by 2050, which, by the way, would just completely decimate the Western world because China's and other Eastern nations are never going to go for that. Never in a million years. It would also create a, quote, right to a healthy environment as a sort of human right, which of course could be used by government to do just about anything they want, almost any crazy environmental policy you can think of, from seizing people's lands to shutting down businesses and industries wholesale, could be justified under a, quote, right to a healthy environment. They also want a biodiversity framework that would reverse nature loss and biodiversity loss. Well, how do you do that? That doesn't just mean we are going to stop consuming land. We're going to stop building and expanding places for people to live and businesses and stuff like that. It also means we need to take some of the damage we've done and reverse that damage and go backwards in time. Well, how are we going to do that when we have a growing global population? How are we going to say, okay, no more biodiversity loss anywhere in the world? We're going to stop that right now. I mean, I'm all for reasonable protections for nature and the environment and all of that. I really am. I grew up in the middle of the forest. I love nature. I go hiking all the time. I go fishing. I love nature. But people need a place to live. People need food to eat. People are important. People are more important than nature. I know that's crazy to some people, but it's true. And if you have these crazy biodiversity frameworks and broad rights to a healthy environment and massive Green New Deal programs, how are you going to have places for people to live? How are people going to be able to afford to pay for their energy? How are they going to have reliable energy if most energy comes from windmills and solar panels, which require the wind to be blowing and the sun to be shining, which isn't always happening, in case you haven't noticed? This is a radical environmental program that the United Nations has put together. And it's all part of this Our Common Agenda Summit of the Future, Pact for the Future program, which again, in less than a year, September 2024, is going to be formally voted on by member states. And again, the Biden administration has already said, although they may not agree with everything that's in the current version of Our Common Agenda, they do agree with a lot. They like a lot of it. And I'm not making that up. You can Google Biden administration, Our Common Agenda, and you'll find ambassadors to the United Nations in the Biden administration, people like Chris Liu, saying positive things about Our Common Agenda, talking about how the United States is looking forward to working on this project. And the details for Our Common Agenda and the Pact for the Future are being developed right now. Right now. Do you hear anybody in the news media talking about it? Nope. Very, very few people are talking about it. Why is that? Why is that? I mean, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but it's because they don't want you to know what they're working on. They don't want you to know about this. It's all out in the open, and it's also concealed at the same time. It's pretty unbelievable how that works, isn't it? So this whole Americans stop eating meat, that's an important story, because if that happened, obviously people's lives would dramatically change. Whole industries would be wiped out. Farmers would lose their livelihoods. There would be some good things that come from that, and there would be bad things that come from that. But that's not the most dangerous part of this whole story. The most dangerous part is what comes next. And they're going to tell you it's necessary to fight climate change, that that's the justification behind all of this, when in reality, we know it isn't. Because if that were true, they wouldn't allow China to continue to dramatically increase its methane emissions. It wouldn't allow China to continue to lie about its various environmental commitments. It wouldn't allow China, a human rights violator, a seat at the table on all of these different initiatives when they have repeatedly lied and misled people and built coal plants when they say they're not, they're going to try to scale that back, and we're going to switch to renewable energy, and then they build a whole bunch of more coal plants. I mean, they're not serious. They wouldn't be flying in their private jets to Dubai, which isn't really near any highly populated areas, by the way. They wouldn't do that. They're doing it. They're doing all of these things because they have an agenda. Some of them involved at this COP28 have a financial agenda. Some of them have political agendas. Some of them probably really believe they're making the world a better place. I don't know, but I think most of them don't. I think most of them have something to gain for themselves. Maybe they're just looking for votes. I don't know. But they don't actually believe, most of them, that what they're doing at COP28 is going to result in lower global temperature, because they've seen the same information that I've seen. They know that that isn't going to happen, and that China has no interest in committing economic suicide by going along with their crazy environmental policies. They know that too. And so until China decides to change its policies, and Indonesia and India and a whole bunch of other countries around the world, there's no reason for the United States to destroy its economy and force its citizens, or discourage its citizens even, to eat meat and force them to change their lifestyles, etc. Because in the end, it's not going to have any impact so long as the rest of the world is able to do what they've been doing. Okay, that's enough for today. We're probably going to have more on COP28. We're going to have more on some of these big globalist plans. We've got Davos coming up. Davos 2024 is going to be held in, I believe, January or February. So that's going to be a huge thing we'll be covering. But until then, I'm Justin Haskins. Please subscribe to the channel. If you haven't subscribed, share the video, like the video, leave a comment. All of that's going to help me out. And until next time, please, please, please keep enjoying those burgers if you like burgers. Keep enjoying the burgers if you like burgers. Keep having the meat if you like it. And also, stay free.